Welcome to a history of ancient shoes. Before the wheel. Before writing. Before cities rose from the dust, humans were already solving one of their oldest problems: how to protect the feet that carried them across a hostile world. This is the story of the shoe. Not as fashion. Not as luxury. But as survival. Let's go back. Further than Egypt. Further than Sumer. Back to a time before recorded history, when our ancestors first looked down at their bare feet, fat and bleeding from stone and ice, and decided there had to be a better way. In 2008, archaeologists digging in a cave in Armenia called Arini 1 found something extraordinary. A single leather shoe, remarkably preserved by a thick layer of sheep dung that had sealed it away from oxygen and decay for over 5,500 years. It was stuffed with grass, perhaps for warmth, perhaps to help it hold its shape. This shoe predates the pyramids of Giza. It predates Stonehenge. It is, to this day, one of the oldest leather shoes ever discovered, and it tells us something remarkable. Humans were crafting fitted, sewn footwear long before they built their first great monuments. But even that shoe wasn't the beginning. Scientists studying the bones of ancient human feet have found evidence of something subtler, a change in toe bone structure dating back over 40,000 years. Bare feet gripping the earth develop strong, curled toes. But feet that are supported by footwear develop differently, weaker, straighter toes. This shift suggests that long before anyone thought to bury a leather shoe in a cave, early humans in Ice Age Europe were already wrapping their feet in something, perhaps hide, perhaps woven bark, for warmth against the brutal cold of the Pleistocene. And then there's Otzi. The famous mummy, frozen in the Alps for over 5,000 years, found in 1991 by hikers who stumbled upon what they thought was a lost mountaineer. Otzi's feet tell an incredible story of ancient engineering. His shoes were a masterpiece of layered insulation, an outer shell of deer hide, an inner net of tree bark string, and stuffed inside, soft grass for warmth, functioning almost like ancient wool socks. This was not primitive guesswork. This was a person who understood thermal insulation, who had tested and refined a design good enough to survive a trek through freezing alpine terrain. As humanity moved from scattered bands into the first great civilizations, footwear evolved with them, and it began to reveal something new. Status. In ancient Egypt, sandals made from woven papyrus and palm leaves were the footwear of choice along the Nile. But not everyone wore them. For much of early Egyptian history, sandals were reserved for the wealthy, for priests, for pharaohs. Ordinary laborers often went barefoot, especially in the fields. Tutankhamun himself was buried with dozens of pairs of sandals, some so ornately decorated they were clearly never meant to touch the ground. One extraordinary pair found in his tomb showed painted images of bound captives on the soles, meaning that every time the boy king walked, he symbolically trampled his enemies underfoot. A shoe, in this world, was a political statement. Travel east to Mesopotamia, and the terrain itself shaped the shoe. In the flat river plains of Sumer and Akkad, simple woven sandals were common, made from reed and palm fiber, cheap and easy to replace in a hot climate. But the mountainous regions bordering the Zagros demanded something sturdier. Here we find some of the earliest evidence of soft leather boots, turned up at the toe, a design so effective it would echo for thousands of years in the footwear of later empires across Persia and Anatolia. 84,519. Further south and east, in the Indus Valley, one of the world's earliest urban civilizations left behind surprisingly little direct evidence of footwear, since leather and plant fiber rarely survive in that climate. But depictions on seals and figurines, along with later Vedic texts, suggest simple leather sandals held on with straps were common, particularly for travelers and herders crossing hot sand and rocky ground. In later ancient India, sandals held a curious spiritual dimension. Removing one's shoes before entering a sacred space became, and remains, a deeply rooted custom, treating bare feet as a mark of humility and respect. Wealthier classes wore embellished leather sandals, sometimes with curled, pointed toes, a style that would influence footwear across South Asia for centuries. In ancient Greece, footwear became a marker of citizenship and social class. Sandals were common, but styles varied enormously, from simple leather soles strapped with cord, to elaborate designs favored by the wealthy. Greek soldiers wore heavy military boots called krapes, built for the punishing marches of hoplite warfare. Meanwhile, philosophers were sometimes noted for going barefoot deliberately, treating the rejection of footwear as a symbol of simplicity and rejection of vanity. Socrates himself was known for walking the streets of Athens without shoes, even in winter. Then came Rome, and Rome, as it did with roads and law, systematized the shoe. Roman footwear became remarkably specific. Soldiers wore the caligae, thick-soled military sandals reinforced with iron hobnails, designed to survive thousands of miles of marching across the empire's roads. The sound of Roman legions was, quite literally, the sound of nailed leather striking stone. Senators wore a different style entirely, a closed shoe called the calceus, often dyed a specific shade of red reserved only for their rank. Emperors had their own colors. Wealth had its own materials: gold thread, dyed leather, jeweled clasps. In Rome, you could tell a person's entire place in society just by glancing at their feet. Across the Mediterranean and into North Africa, footwear told a different but equally layered story. In ancient Nubia and Kush, sandals crafted from leather and papyrus closely mirrored Egyptian styles, a reflection of centuries of trade and cultural exchange along the Nile. Further west, across the Sahara's edge, nomadic peoples developed simple leather and hide footwear suited to sand and heat, often little more than a sole strapped across the foot, prioritizing airflow over coverage. In sub-Saharan Africa, archaeological evidence for footwear is sparser, since many communities went barefoot by both climate and custom, but where footwear did appear, particularly among herding and trading peoples, hides were cut and wrapped directly around the foot, a simple, adaptable design passed down through generations. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, ancient China was developing its own distinct footwear traditions. Silk shoes, embroidered slippers, and eventually wooden-soled designs appear throughout early Chinese dynastic history. Footwear here was deeply tied to textile artistry, a natural extension of a civilization that had already mastered silk production and intricate embroidery. In Japan, the ancestor of what would become the geta, a wooden sandal raised on two supports, began appearing in early forms, originally practical, designed to lift the wearer's feet above muddy rice paddies and wet ground. Wealth had its own materials: gold thread, dyed leather, jeweled clasps. In Rome, you could tell a person's entire place in society just by glancing at their feet. Across the Mediterranean and into North Africa, footwear told a different but equally layered story. In ancient Nubia and Kush, sandals crafted from leather and papyrus closely mirrored Egyptian styles, a reflection of centuries of trade and cultural exchange along the Nile. Further west, across the Sahara's edge, nomadic peoples developed simple leather and hide footwear suited to sand and heat, often little more than a sole strapped across the foot, prioritizing airflow over coverage. In sub-Saharan Africa, archaeological evidence for footwear is sparser, since many communities went barefoot by both climate and custom, but where footwear did appear, particularly among herding and trading peoples, hides were cut and wrapped directly around the foot, a simple, adaptable design passed down through generations. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, ancient China was developing its own distinct footwear traditions. Silk shoes, embroidered slippers, and eventually wooden-soled designs appear throughout early Chinese dynastic history. Footwear here was deeply tied to textile artistry, a natural extension of a civilization that had already mastered silk production and intricate embroidery. In Japan, the ancestor of what would become the geta, a wooden sandal raised on two supports, began appearing in early forms, originally practical, designed to lift the wearer's feet above muddy rice paddies and wet ground. Across the Americas, entirely separate footwear traditions developed with no contact whatsoever from the Old World. Indigenous peoples of North America crafted moccasins from tanned hide, soft, flexible, and perfectly adapted to forest terrain, allowing for near-silent movement while hunting. In the harsh Andes, sandals were woven from tough plant fibers, sturdy enough to handle punishing terrain of mountain trade routes that stretched for thousands of miles, connecting civilizations that would later become the Inca. What's striking, looking across all these civilizations, is that they arrived at strikingly similar solutions despite having no contact with one another. Wrap the foot. Protect the soul. Adapt the design to the ground beneath you. It suggests something almost universal about human ingenuity, that necessity really does produce remarkably parallel invention, no matter where on earth you are standing. And yet, look closer, and shoes were never only about protection. From the very beginning, they carried meaning far beyond function. A pharaoh's sandals proclaimed his dominance over his enemies. A Roman senator's dyed shoes proclaimed his rank in a rigid hierarchy. A barefoot philosopher proclaimed his rejection of material excess. A worshipper removing sandals at a temple threshold proclaimed humility before something greater than himself. Even something as basic as footwear became a language, silently communicating who a person was in the eyes of their society, long before they ever spoke a word. Shoes also tell us about the body itself. That subtle shift in toe bone structure found in ancient skeletons is a quiet reminder that changing our tools changes us, even at the level of our bones. The moment humans began wrapping their feet, evolution began to respond. By the time the great classical civilizations reached their height, footwear had already gone through a startling transformation, from a simple survival tool wrapped in animal hide in a frozen cave, to an elaborate symbol of empire, class, and identity, stitched in leather, dyed in royal colors, woven from silk, or wrapped from hide, and buried alongside kings for the next life. The next time you tie your shoes without a second thought, remember, this is one of humanity's oldest technologies. It survived ice ages. It marched with empires. It was buried with pharaohs. Every step you take is, in some small way, still connected to a person standing in an Armenian cave more than 5,000 years ago, wrapping grass and leather around their feet, and beginning a journey their descendants are still walking today. This has been the history of the ancient shoe. Thank you for watching.